thank you again, Anthony Spira, for setting up this whole exhibition. I remember very well when you visited my office, it must have been 3 years ago at least, when you had the first germ of this idea. And I could tell from that moment that it was going to happen. And here we are. Anyway, I'm very flattered that you asked me to contribute to these scholastic aspects of it. You did not deceive me when you said that Milton Keynes was a modernist utopia, but you did when you said it's only an hour from London, because this morning we got here in half an hour. You could hardly see the countryside, it was moving so fast. Anyway, Anthony again is key to this in that he was director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery, and well, we'll demote you for the purposes of this conversation. And the Whitechapel Art Gallery is extremely important in our understanding of Stubbs, who, for various reasons, after his death in 1806, fell into something akin to disrepute. This process was reversed when in the 50s, a very important exhibition was organized at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. And that kick-started an appreciation which I would say is still, to some extent, in the foothills, as we gradually begin to understand more about an artist who is extremely badly documented, but of the very highest quality and the most energized curiosity. I have chosen to speak today about a very, very difficult period, the 1744 to 1758, because this is probably the least well-documented of a very badly documented artist's oeuvre. But I like a challenge, and I'm going to be asking as many questions as I hope to provide tentative answers today. And the starting point, for obvious reasons, if we can get this to work, which I can't, is Liverpool. I was brought up in Liverpool from the age of 3. It's a city I know extremely well. And I've always kept close interest in developments of research into its history, which are beginning to gather pace after some neglect. One of my favorite quotes about Liverpool in the mid-18th century was that it was a remote commercial town where little is heard of save guinea ships, slaves, blacks, and merchandise. The population, this juncture, approximately 10 to 15,000, difficult to be certain. The street directories don't start until about 1770, but about the same size as New York, but critically, it's the same size also as its neighboring towns of Wigan and Warrington. This is the southwest prospect of Liverpool in the Buck print of 1728. And its wealth was just beginning to grow when Stubbs was born in 1724. His father, as was mentioned earlier on this morning, was a tanner, a very successful one, a similar commercial background to that of Constable. And yet he showed very little interest in pursuing the family business, despite its commercial success. Tanning, if you don't know, is the cleaner end of the leather trade. The currier business is the dirtier one. And it's an intermediary trade which then sells all its products into what was, I think in the mid-18th century, accounted for an enormous amount of trade in leather goods, shoes being an obvious example. But the volume of it was such that it has been estimated that 40% of the GDP of this country was accounted for in the transaction of leather. It was a brave move for Stubbs to step away from that. But the problem was there was no Royal Academy, there was no obvious place to go to learn to paint, and his father said, "I'll only support you if you find someone to teach you," which he did. And this is the man he went to. This is a man called Hamlet Winstanley, who's been referred to this morning again, a pupil of Kneller. He was at the great Queen Street Academy from 1711. Not particularly gifted, but worked both in London and in Warrington, and was very much on the right side of the Earl of Derby. And he and Stubbs got together. He was allegedly, according to Esaias Humphrey, who is Stubbs's main biographer and our only apparently reliable source for most information, paid a shilling a day, which was a pretty generous stipend. And the deal was that he was going to copy a lot of Lord Derby's pictures, and along with other pupils of Winstanley, because there are others recorded as living with him, to assist in the painting, presumably of drapery and other requirements of an apprentice indentured at that time. So that relationship begins when Stubbs is about 16 years old, in about 1740. This information coming from Esaias Humphrey. And the relationship was fraught and fractious. Very quickly they rowed over the copying of a Poussin and a Van Dyck in the Derby collection. And Stubbs went off in a huff. This is Winstanley. You can see how seriously he took himself. This is an ivory plaque that was acquired by the V&A about 30 years ago. I remember it well. It appeared on the front of the Burlington magazine. Nobody knew who Hamlet Winstanley was or who GVDR was. It appears it's by a man called Van der Hagen, who was in a Dutch circle of painters that I will touch on a bit later on. But it shows Winstanley as a virtuoso, not just as a painter, but also as an art dealer. He was advising Derby on acquisitions in Rome, and Knowsley today has a lot of muniments which are gradually being researched, and Stephen Lloyd is here today, who's from Knowsley, and all sorts of things are emerging about how the Earl of Derby orchestrated and organised the acquisitions of his major collections in the early 1720s in particular, from Rome to Lancashire. It's an astonishing piece of archival material that awaits further publication. Francis Russell set the thing in motion, but there's a lot more work to be done now that the new material is surfacing. Here's another image of Winstanley as a self-portrait. This shows him on copper as a miniaturist. Again, he looks like quite a curmudgeonly sort of character, and you can see why he and Stubbs didn't really get on. In terms of its quality, it's rather better than almost anything else I've ever seen by Winstanley, which makes me wonder if it's not by somebody slightly better. But for the time being, that's what it's called, and that's what George Schaff called it when he saw it at the National Portrait Gallery in the 19th century, and thus it has remained. That is in a private collection. This is a portrait by Winstanley, and this is where Stubbs is the next stage of Stubbs's life comes into play. Humphrey tells us that by 1744, when Stubbs was 20, he had left Winstanley at the age of 16, and he was starting to do his own anatomical dissections, and that he was basically being financed by his mother. But in 1744, he makes his way to Wigan. Wigan is where this man, John Blackburn, lives. John Blackburn was a botanist. His daughter, Anna, was a correspondent of Linnaeus. And in the background, you can see the conservatory where he grew pineapples, and the sort of palimpsest, which underneath that painting of a conservatory, there is a pineapple. And he also grew cotton to the quality that he was actually able to make a dress for his daughter. He lived at a house called Orford Hall in Wigan. And this picture I was involved in many years ago and is now gone back to Warrington Museum, which was exciting for them to acquire. This is a portrait of a man called George Patton, a very successful copper merchant by Winstanley, which is in Warrington Museum and hangs on the staircase there today. You can go and look at it with the portrait of John Blackburn. This is of interest. It's dated 1737, just before Stubbs goes and joins Winstanley in that studio. But if you look carefully around the head, you will see that the canvas is actually an insert. And what has happened is that the head has been painted by Winstanley. The canvas, and this is quite well documented in correspondence, is sent to London, and the costume is painted by a man called Joseph Van Aken. Now, Joseph Van Aken and his brother Alexander ran a very successful drapery practice in London, and what painters like Winstanley, he wasn't alone, would do was exactly that. They would send the head down to London, and you didn't have to send the whole canvas, and then back would come a picture which you could sell as your own work, but all the drapery was done by these extremely talented pair of drapery painters who were based in Covent Garden. This is the Blackburn family. This is painted in 1741, slightly later, but just prior to Stubbs coming to join John Blackburn in his household in 1744. It's said, Humphrey states that Blackburn took on Stubbs because he looked like a son that he just lost. Well, not only is the son lost, but so is the picture lost. And I'm hoping one day that will turn up. This is known from a photograph taken in the 1920s. But it shows him, and his daughter Anna is in the center. She is the Linnaean correspondent. And they lived in this house called Orford Hall, which was knocked down in the 1930s in Wigan in some pomp, with a very, very fine botanical and famous botanical garden. There it is, before it was demolished in the early 20th century. The park survives. You can go and visit it. It sits in Orford between Wigan and Warrington. Stubbs stays, according to Humphrey, for a short while with Blackburn, and then moves on to Wigan itself. This is a view of Warrington in about 1780, showing its prosperity. It's the only image of Warrington of that date, and quite stylized. But again, about the same size and population level as Liverpool at that date. If I can, there's no image, unfortunately, of Wigan. All we know is from Humphrey, and he goes to Wigan for 8 months, and all the time he's painting portraits. Well, none of these portraits have turned up, and they may yet. I'm sure something will sooner or later. But York is a slightly more fruitful area, so he goes on to York. And again, this information comes from Humphrey, and he arrives there, and in date terms, probably just after the Jacobite problems of late 1745 or 1746. We know he's there by 1746, and he's painting this type of portrait. This is, in fact, by an artist called Benjamin Wilson, who was a Leeds-based artist closely associated with the Fitzwilliam family at Wentworth Woodhouse. Here we have a better image of Hull. This is the next place that Stubbs visits. He seems to have been oscillating between York and Hull for quite a long period of time, and it's unclear what the motives were, presumably from one portrait commission to the next. This being pertinent to the present exhibition. There's been some arguments about the dating of this double portrait, but it was obviously a key commission. The death of Henry Nelthorpe, who's seated on the right in 1746, would indicate that it can't be any later than that, although I remember having conversations with Judy Edgerton about this as to whether it was possibly a posthumous portrait. I think on balance, I would say it is done from life, but it does present problems of A, the location, and B, the evolution of Stubbs's style. If this is how he was working at this date, this must create a sort of template for what we're looking for all the missing portraits. Again, Humphrey says that he was working for Lady Nelthorpe, who's seated to the left, with an interesting lily of the valley in her left hand, painting all her friends in the area. But again, very few of these portraits have turned up, but I'm going to show you one or two things that might be candidates for that. So if this becomes the template for 1746, and this is in fact not a posthumous portrait, all portraits of Stubbs that we're looking for have to be judged by this as a terra firma, if you like. And the Nelthorpe family lived in a place called Brigg in Lincolnshire. They were previously in a house called Baysgarth, and this picture has since moved to the present house, and was presumably once over a fireplace. It's in extremely good condition. It's never been tampered with, and so is an object lesson in what an 18th century portrait should look like in terms of its condition. Whether he was moving backwards and forwards between Hull and York at this time is difficult to ascertain, but presumably he was simply going where the commissions were. The painting of the book in Lady Nelthorpe's hand reminds one of the fact that Stubbs came from a tanning family. It is very lovingly and brilliantly observed. In every aspect, this portrait is, although much criticised in the press, is most brilliantly unconventional piece of painting. Double portraits are one of the hardest things to do. I know I spend my life looking at portraits, and there's always some sort of imbalance. And this is a very good example of how a portrait can be balanced and at the same time express the psychology of the sitters and their interrelationship. So 1746, Stubbs is 22 years old, a remarkable achievement for someone of that age. Now, the question one asks oneself, and I've always asked myself, is, yes, he was an anatomist, yes, he was a horse painter, but if this period when he's painting horses, if he can achieve this level of competence, where are the others? This type of fluency indicates someone who is painting constantly, not someone who's doing it in a dilettante-ish, amateur sort of way. So that is one of the biggest questions of this period, is, you know, where are all these portraits? Well, every now and then something turns up. This was shown to me, and I'm not clear absolutely yet. I've asked for it to be given some conservation, but has a strong case for being taken very seriously, in that the sitter lived in an estate very close to the Nelthorpes. The sitter is called Anne Booth. She married a man called Benjamin Hayworth. They were about 15 miles away from the Nelthorpes in Lincolnshire, and this is the type of unconventional portrait that we should perhaps be looking at for possible candidature. The painting of the dog is exceptionally good. This is another example. This is something I was shown many years ago. I've never seen the actual picture, but again, in terms of its stylization, it reminds me very much in technique. I've only seen this in black and white, but I'll take you on further to the other possible candidates and the type of portrait painters of this period who we are looking at as a point of comparison. Again, when this one eventually does turn up, it'll be something that will be of great interest. Particularly of great interest is the depiction of the flowers, which appear to be specific to a particular time of year, which again would be consistent with the botanical interest that permeates Stubbs's work throughout his career. This is a recent discovery. Not everybody has agreed, but I'm inclined to. But it tells a story in that it sat for many years at a house called Swinnerton in Staffordshire. It is the father of the famous Mrs. Fitzherbert, and he's called Walter Smythe. And this was always called Henry Pickering. Now, Henry Pickering is another pupil of Hamlet Winstanley. He's recorded as working with Winstanley in 1727, but he goes on to establish an independent practice in Liverpool area. He works in Cheshire, he works in Leicestershire. Very, very competent painter, but always a little bit too near the ground. This is an exceptional thing, and it was very clever Francis Russell to pick up on what this actually is. Walter Smith, this is the 3125. The detail shows you again that it is no ordinary 18th century portrait. I mean, one sees a lot that one walks past, but one of the things that I noticed, and I have seen in other Stubbs, is the acuity of the painting of the eyes. If you look very closely, even in that scale, I think you can see that there's light coming through a window, and that light is reflecting on the pupils. So he's looking sort of beyond the obvious and making an art form out of the precise, and it is sort of sitting on the edges of an anatomical dissection. Now, the dating of this is as problematic as all these portraits, because this man was married in Liverpool in 1746. The temptation is to equate it with that moment in his life. So for the time being, this is called 1746. But I've never compared them physically together, obviously, but to compare this with the Nelthorpe portrait next door, I would, in an attempt at what they call chain date, suggest this is even slightly earlier. So this could perhaps date from even these sort of earlier 1740s, and maybe 1744. And in terms of its palette, it is not quite as ambitious as the Nelthorpe double portrait. But for the time being, that sits as proposed 1746, so 2 years after he's left his home. This is another portrait that I was shown some years ago, which I thought had a very good case for possibly being Liverpool period, of a slightly later date after he's got back from Rome. The detail of it is, again, the extreme acuteness of the observation reminds one a little bit of the portraits by Bellini. Had he seen something in Italy, and was this done after he gets back from his Italian sojourn in 1755? Well, we have another picture which is known only from an old photograph, which is held in Liverpool, of a man called Joseph Gildart, the Lord Mayor. This man was painted by Joseph Wright of Derby in the late 1760s. Could this, again, I've never seen the picture, this is all we know, last seen in the south of France in 1911, but something of the lighting and the type of observation does lend support to the suggestion that this might be a Liverpool portrait by Stubbs, just post-dating his return from the visit to Italy he made in 1754. This picture sits in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool and brings into play a very interesting man called William Caddick. William Caddick worked with Liverpool as a young artist and had his own studio after Stubbs left the city. This belonged to a man called Joseph Mayer, who Stubbs is one of Stubbs' biographers in the 19th century, and has come down rather curiously titled Portrait of George Stubbs by Richard Caddick. Well, those dates simply don't work, but Richard Caddick Sr. might have painted this. He was born in 1719. However, the muddle might well have been the other way around. And is this possibly a portrait of Richard Caddick, George Stubbs' young friend, by Stubbs himself? Anyway, that's work in progress, but that picture is now in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, and further conservation work will be done on it in due course, and we'll be able to look at it more closely. Again, the dating of this would either be just pre the Rome expedition or just post, on the basis of the costume. But it is a rather remarkable thing. So here we have York showing the image of what a prosperous place and an attractive place for an artist like Stubbs to go after he'd finished his travels in Leeds, Wigan, and Liverpool and Hull. And this portrait is of a man called Wood. He lived at Hollin Hall in Copmanthorpe, which is about 4 miles outside of York. This is dated 1749 and is very much in the style of Benjamin Wilson, but again rather more acutely observed. The type of portrait that should be perhaps be considered as the type of work that Stubbs was doing at the time when we know he was in York. This is a recent emergence at the Ferrens Art Gallery in Hull. Can be pretty precisely dated because of the Aetatis Suae inscription in the bottom right-hand corner. And this is a man called George Fothergill, a non-juror, so possibly a Jacobite, a shy draper who kept his head down, had a very expensive watch, as you can see. And this picture was attributed in 1954 by Ellis Waterhouse to the Circle of Thomas Gainsborough, which gives you a flavour of the problem of the attribution of these things. None of them are signed, that's the problem. But this, despite its condition, you can see the face is quite worn, is a very powerful portrait. And I think the attribution, which is a recent one, does stick. Stubbs likes using that cartouche, the circle, the oval within the rectangle on occasion, which is not inconsistent, but he adds a dimension to it by creating a sort of a ridge to the edge of the repoussoir, and it increases the sense of realism. And were this picture in perfect condition, it would be a very remarkable thing, but it's something that the Ferrens are rightly proud of. So we can flick through a bit faster now. This is a securely dated and signed portrait in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, a portrait of a cousin of the Earl of Derby. He's called James Stanley of Ormskirk. This was acquired by the Walker Art Gallery in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. James Stanley lived at Cross Hall, near Ormskirk, not far from Liverpool, and is a picture well worth visiting if you're in the Walker. Again, its condition has suffered, as you can see, but it's been well restored, and the penetration of the observation sets it apart from, in its type, almost any other type of 18th century English portrait painting. It's pretty securely dated to Christmas 1755, which is the transcription of what's written on the back of the canvas. And that tells us that Stubbs must have returned from Italy in order to have painted this portrait. And the inscription does seem to be contemporaneous. But even more interesting about this is having thought about it, in the knowledge that Hamlet Winstanley was employing the Van Eycken brothers, is the drapery of this portrait up to snuff? I mean, is it quite as good as the drapery we see in, for example, the Nelthorpe double portrait next door? I would say it is not. There were two Van Eycken brothers, one was better than the other. Joseph died in 1749. His brother Alexander dies in 1756. Is it possible that Stubbs, like almost every other portrait painter worth their salt in the north of England, and otherwise were sending their portraits to London to have the drapery done? So I just posit the theory here, which I don't think has ever been done before, is that Stubbs, who was a collaborator all his life, was employing Joseph Van Eycken to do drapery for him for a less important commission. James Stanley was a second cousin of the Earl of Derby, so not top-notch, but someone who would perhaps be happy to have collaboration rather than the work by the whole man. Here we come again to the stylistic problems of Stubbs. This is the 11-year-old Sir John Nelthorpe, son of the couple in the double portrait. There appears to be no stylistic development here. This was shown recently at the Usher Gallery in Lincoln, and had a good chance to have a good look at it. In technique, it's identical to the treatment of his parents, which would suggest that his style had not moved on at all. But that's not to its detriment, because it's a very beautiful portrait. The pose is effectively of the young Charles II by Van Dyck, but there are other resonances to it as well, and it's the landscape which is perhaps the closest in style to the the double portrait next door. This again is in, having never been touched really, is in extraordinarily good condition. So it has become a sort of template for what Stubbs' portraits look like. But the problem remains, is if this is painted in 1756 and the portrait of his parents is painted in 1746, his style has not moved on one iota, nor has the chromatic balance within it. I mean, I asked the question, is he looking at Spanish painting? 1756, he's just back from Italy. He would have seen Spanish paintings in Rome. Is this what he has in mind? And is the development more to do with pose than it is to do with technique? There's no question in my mind also that the whistle jacket is quite Velázquez-like in flavor. So I think Spanish, the Iberian factor does come into play, and of course there were Spanish paintings in Rome and Livorno, through which Stubbs went to get to Rome in 1754. Okay, so this is just a picture which used to be quite well known and was bought by Paul Mellon and is in Yale, and I went to see that physically recently. It's always intrigued me very much because it was bought as by Stubbs and then demoted, and every other attribution has been posited for it. I would reverse that. I think this is by Stubbs, and I think this is a transition period picture which shows his weaknesses and his strengths, but I think the treatment of the foliage and the background in particular resonate with the portrait of the young Nelthorpe. I mean, in format, it reminds me of Poussin. I think he's looking at pictures in Italy, and I would say this is described as the Wilson family. It's a very large-scale composition, not in very good state, but there are aspects of it that are consistent with what then surfaces at a later moment at Goodwood. So we're here through now to 1758. Here we have Stubbs in his early pomp. We're on the 1759 is the date of Quebec. The map of the world is changing. Money is pouring into the country, and the third Duke of Richmond, who was educated at Leiden, sees the point of Stubbs and says, "Go for it." He paints these three big hunting pieces, two of which I'm showing, which are pivotal pictures in the history of British art, and he was given a complete carte blanche to construct. One can see the argument, which not everyone will agree with, but this is the way Stubbs was beginning to think in terms of his portraiture, and in response to the hunting requirement. But there are similarities. Anyway, if this picture were cleaned and conserved, which it needs to be in the future, that might become clearer as to what it actually is. So here we have a jump. We're dealing with very little information, and connoisseurship has to play a large role in it. But how otherwise do we explain that a painter can reach this level of competence in the late 1750s, which Humphrey tells us is the date of the commission, and there's no reason to question that, from a point like this in 1746? It must indicate that he was active, not just as a traveller in Rome, not just as dissecting for the anatomy of the horse in Hawkstow, which he then publishes later in 1766, but he's also painting portraits. So how does he get from this to this? I mean, this, if we believe the dating of this is 1756 to 59, and I'd be inclined to think it's slightly later, this was what we call the early maturity. And is Lebrun and the answer, the Lebrun prints are on show here. Is he beginning to look at the psychology of the potential of portraiture? So moving from something like this in 1746 through to something like this in 1756? Well, the answer is yes, but it's an astonishing trajectory at this stage, and I think the real development seems to have come in the late 50s through to about 1760. This is a portrait of a man called John Smith, the banksman. It was at Wentworth Woodhouse, another great client. This hung alongside of Van Dyck at Wentworth Woodhouse and turned up, again, unknown, but referred to by Arthur Young when he visited the house and was sold a few years ago. It is a most extraordinary picture. He was the man given the job to count the coal when it came off the land, and there was quite a lot of it at Wentworth Woodhouse, as I'm sure you know. Anyway, it tells us everything I think we need to know about what Stubbs was capable of achieving in portraiture at the date when he starts to move off into equine world. So I'll leave you with the Peter Pindar statement, which is later, I think it's 1786, in the Ode. It is said that naught so much the temper rubs of that ingenious artist, Mr. Stubbs, as calling him a horse painter, how strange that Stubbs the title should desire to change. So more questions than answers, but I hope that gives you a snapshot of the questions I've been asking.